From as far back as memory can reach, childhood unfolds not as a place of warmth or safety, but as a long corridor of quiet omissions, where love is not violently denied but gently, persistently withheld, and that absence becomes more confusing and more damaging than outright cruelty. The parents are physically present yet emotionally distant, moving through daily life with an efficiency that leaves little room for curiosity about feelings, fears, or small triumphs. Birthdays pass with generic wishes, if remembered at all, and school milestones. First prizes, certificates, small moments of pride carried home with trembling hands, are met with distracted nods or delayed acknowledgments that drain the excitement before it has a chance to settle. The child learns early that enthusiasm must be self-contained, that joy expressed too loudly is met with indifference, and disappointment expressed at all is an inconvenience. Family gatherings reinforce this lesson. Conversations flow around siblings, cousins, or even strangers, while the child remains on the periphery, present but unseen, like furniture that has always been there and therefore no longer needs noticing. Over time, this pattern quietly rewires expectations. Praise becomes something other people receive. Comfort becomes something to seek elsewhere, or not at all. Even pain is learned to be managed silently, because asking for care feels like interrupting something more important. The neglect is subtle enough to be deniable. There are no dramatic scenes, no clear villains, only 1,000 small moments where attention goes elsewhere and never circles back. A missed school play because something came up. A parent scrolling through a phone while the child explains their day. A report card placed on the counter and forgotten under unopened mail. Each instance alone seems trivial, but together they form a narrative the child absorbs deeply. You do not matter enough to be centered. Validation, when it comes, is conditional and transactional, linked to usefulness, obedience, or how well the child avoids becoming a problem. Emotional needs are framed as overreactions. Sensitivity is dismissed as weakness. Slowly, the child internalizes a belief that needing anything at all is a flaw. They become hyper, aware of others' moods, learning to shrink themselves to fit the emotional climate of the house, to stay quiet when tension rises, to disappear when conflict threatens. Being low maintenance becomes a survival strategy mistaken for maturity, praised by outsiders who never see the cost. Inside, however, a low hum of loneliness persists, a sense of watching life through glass. Even moments that should feel significant, graduations, achievements, personal breakthroughs, carry a hollow echo because the people whose acknowledgement would make them real are emotionally absent. The child begins to doubt their own experiences. If no one reacts, did it really happen? If no one celebrates, was it really worth anything? This doubt seeps into identity, shaping self. Worth not through overt rejection, but through chronic invisibility. Love becomes something theoretical, observed in others but rarely felt firsthand. The household language lacks emotional vocabulary. Feelings are not discussed, only managed or avoided. When the child is hurt, the response is minimization. You're too sensitive. It's not that big of a deal. Other kids have it worse. These phrases, repeated over years, teach the child to distrust their inner world. They stop naming pain and start normalizing it. They learn to perform competence early, to appear self-sufficient not because they are, but because no one is coming to help. This premature independence is mistaken for strength, but it is built on neglect. The parents may provide materially, food, shelter, education, but emotional nourishment is absent, leaving a developed mental hunger that is never addressed. As adolescence arrives, the gap widens. While peers rebel or seek guidance, the child drifts further into emotional isolation, unsure how to ask for support and convinced it would be futile anyway. Attempts to connect feel awkward and unsafe. Vulnerability has never been rewarded. Instead, the child becomes an observer, studying how other families interact, quietly comparing and wondering what it would feel like to be chosen without having to earn it. Hope flickers occasionally. Maybe next time they'll notice, Maybe this achievement will be big enough. Maybe this moment will finally matter. But each hope ends the same way, with silence or distraction, reinforcing the lesson that expectation leads to disappointment. Over years, this pattern solidifies into a core belief system. Affection is scarce, attention must be rationed, and asking for either is risky. The pain is not dramatic. It is dull, persistent, and cumulative, like erosion rather than explosion. There is no single memory to point to, no definitive moment that explains everything, only a lifelong accumulation of being overlooked. And because the neglect is quiet, it is easy for others to dismiss, and even easier for the child to question their own experience. They weren't abusive. The child tells themselves they did their best, but best still left an empty space where affirmation should have been. That emptiness follows the child into adulthood, shaping relationships, self-talk, and expectations long before they have the language to understand it. What breaks them later is not one act, but the final confirmation of a truth they have been living with all along, that being ignored was never an accident, it was the pattern. The approach of the 21st birthday carries a weight far heavier than a date on the calendar, because it becomes a private contract between hope and history, a single day onto which the narrator projects everything that has been missing for years. Unlike previous birthdays, quietly endured with lowered expectations and practiced smiles, this one feels different, charged with symbolism and promise. 21 is not just another year. It represents adulthood, legitimacy, arrival. It is the age people speak about in definitive terms, the threshold where a person is no longer becoming, but is. In the narrator's mind, this birthday transforms into a final test, the moment that will finally force acknowledgement, as if the significance of the number itself will compel the parents to pause, look up, and see the child they have so often overlooked. There is an unspoken belief that surely this milestone cannot be ignored, that it carries a cultural gravity too strong to dismiss. In the weeks leading up to it, hope quietly rebuilds itself, despite years of evidence warning against it. The narrator imagines small but meaningful gestures, a genuine conversation, a thoughtful message, maybe even a simple acknowledgement that feels intentional rather than obligatory. They don't need extravagance, they need recognition. They need to feel seen. This internal buildup is almost embarrassing in its optimism, because it is rooted less in reality and more in longing, yet it persists with stubborn resilience. The narrator begins to reinterpret past neglect as misunderstanding rather than indifference, telling themselves that perhaps their parents simply didn't realize how much those moments mattered. Maybe adulthood will change the dynamic. Maybe this is when parents finally shift their gaze, recognizing the person their child has become. The birthday becomes a symbolic crossroads, a point where the narrator believes the story could finally turn. Preparations are minimal on the outside, but intense internally. Every passing day sharpens anticipation, and with it, vulnerability. The narrator becomes hyper, aware of small signs, casual mentions of plans, subtle changes in tone, any hint that the parents are thinking about the date. Each neutral interaction is overanalyzed, each silence reinterpreted as strategic rather than careless. There is a quiet belief that this time the parents are planning something meaningful, even if it's understated. The narrator imagines a version of the day where they feel centered for once, where the focus does not drift elsewhere, where they are not competing with distractions, obligations, or other people's needs. In this imagined future, adulthood brings a kind of respect that childhood never did. Being 20, one feels like proof of endurance, survival, and growth, and the narrator hopes their parents will finally acknowledge that journey. This birthday is not about cake or gifts, it is about validation. It is about hearing, even once, that their presence matters, that their existence has been noticed and valued. As the day approaches, memories of past birthdays resurface, but instead of dampening hope, they paradoxically intensify it. Those earlier disappointments are reframed as necessary build-up to this moment. as if all the neglect has been leading to a single, inevitable reckoning. The narrator convinces themselves that this is the last time they will allow such hope to exist unguarded. This will be the final chance given, the final benefit of the doubt extended. If it doesn't happen now, they promise themselves, then they will finally accept the truth and move on. That internal promise raises the emotional stakes even higher, turning the birthday into a psychological deadline. The night before, sleep is restless. Thoughts spiral between excitement and dread, optimism and self-protection. The narrator oscillates between imagining warmth and bracing for disappointment, trying to manage expectations while still secretly hoping to be surprised. Morning arrives with an almost ceremonial heaviness. Every notification, every sound, every interaction feels loaded with meaning. Time slows. Each hour that passes without acknowledgement sharpens the awareness of absence, yet hope refuses to fully release its grip. There is still time, the narrator tells themselves. It could happen later. It could happen any moment. The belief persists that adulthood must count for something, that 20. One cannot be treated like all the years before. This birthday becomes a mirror reflecting the narrator's deepest need, to be chosen without conditions, to be recognized without having to perform or prove worth. It is the final hope that the parents will finally step into their role, not as providers or authority figures, but as people capable of seeing their child as an individual with emotional weight. And because this hope is so carefully protected, so desperately needed, it also becomes incredibly fragile. The significance of the day is no longer about celebration, it is about closure. Either the parents will finally show up in a way that confirms belonging, or the narrator will be forced to confront the possibility that the waiting itself has been the mistake. The 21st birthday stands as the last threshold between believing things might change and accepting that they never will, a moment suspended between expectation and reality, heavy with everything that has been left unsaid. The day itself arrives not with drama or confrontation, but with a silence so loud it feels intentional, and that is what makes it unbearable. Morning breaks with an almost painful clarity, the kind that sharpens every sound and thought, and the narrator wakes with a guarded optimism that still hasn't fully died. There is a pause, an instinctive waiting for something to happen, a knock on the door, a message, a simple acknowledgement, but the house moves as it always has, unchanged and indifferent. The parents go about their routines with mechanical normalcy, discussing errands, plans, and other people's needs as if the date carries no meaning at all. No happy birthday, and no shared glance, no shift in energy. At first, the narrator tells themselves it's too early, that recognition might come later in the day, that perhaps something understated is planned. But as hours pass, hope begins to thin, stretched between denial and dawning realization. Breakfast is eaten in silence or fragmented conversation, and the absence of acknowledgement becomes impossible to ignore. The narrator notices how deliberately ordinary everything feels, how easily the day slides into the familiar pattern of being overlooked. When the parent's attention turns towards someone else, a sibling, a relative, a work call, a social obligation, the prioritization cuts deeper than open rejection ever could. The narrator watches as energy, enthusiasm, and concern are freely given elsewhere, while their own milestone remains unspoken. This is not forgetfulness, it is choice. That realization settles slowly, like a weight pressing down on the chest. At some point, the narrator gathers the courage to hint, to create an opening, perhaps mentioning their age or referencing the date, but the response is flat, distracted, or dismissive. A delayed, half-hearted acknowledgement might come, stripped of warmth and meaning, delivered like an afterthought rather than a celebration. Or worse, the parents may react with mild irritation, as if the expectation itself is unreasonable. "You're an adult now," they might say, "birthdays aren't a big deal." The words land with a finality that feels rehearsed, closing the door on any remaining hope. The narrator realizes in that moment that the emotional neglect has not been accidental or unconscious. It has been consistently chosen, justified, and normalized. The pain sharpens not because of what is said, but because of what is confirmed. The child they once were, waiting patiently for attention, finally understands that waiting was never going to change the outcome. The rest of the day unfolds with a surreal detachment. Time stretches, each minute heavy with awareness. The narrator moves through the house feeling like a ghost, hyper, aware of their own presence and simultaneous invisibility. Every ordinary interaction feels cruel in its normalcy. Laughter from another room, casual conversations about trivial matters, plans being made that do not include them. All of it reinforces the message that their existence does not warrant pause or recognition. The birthday, once imagined as a turning point, becomes an emotional reckoning. There is no confrontation because there is nothing left to argue against. The evidence is complete. The parent's behavior is not malicious in an obvious way, which somehow makes it worse. There is no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the hurt. The neglect is wrapped in rationalizations, busyness, practicality, emotional restraint, leaving the narrator with no socially acceptable outlet for their pain. Expressing hurt would only invite dismissal or accusations of being dramatic, so the narrator swallows it as they always have, but this time something inside shifts. The sadness deepens into clarity. The lifetime fear that has hovered quietly in the background, that the neglect was not a misunderstanding, not a failure of awareness, but a reflection of how little emotional value the parents assigned to their child, is no longer abstract. It is proven. The realization fractures something fundamental. It is not just the disappointment of a ruined birthday, it is the collapse of a carefully maintained illusion. The narrator understands now that there was never going to be a moment big enough to force change, no age significant enough to earn recognition. The goalposts were never real. As evening approaches, the finality settles in. The narrator may retreat to their room, scrolling through messages from acquaintances or watching others celebrate milestones online, feeling both disconnected and oddly validated by the contrast. The loneliness is acute, but it is accompanied by a strange numbness, as if the emotional system is shutting down to protect itself. This is the emotional climax, not because it is explosive, but because it is irreversible. Something breaks cleanly, decisively. The narrator no longer wonders if they are asking for too much. They no longer search for hidden explanations or excuses. The pattern is complete, and the truth is undeniable. The parent's inaction speaks louder than any cruel words could. It tells the narrator that their emotional needs were never prioritized, that the neglect was consistent because it was acceptable to those inflicting it. And in that realization, grief takes on a new shape. It is no longer the grief of hoping and being disappointed, but the grief of letting go, of mourning not just the birthday, but the parents they wish they had. The day ends quietly, but it leaves a permanent mark. From this point forward, the narrator will never be able to pretend that the neglect was accidental. The silence of that day echoes backward through every missed milestone and forward into every future interaction, redefining the relationship with painful clarity. In the quiet aftermath, when the day has passed and there is nothing left to wait for, the narrator is left alone with a realization that feels heavier than anger and sharper than sadness. What has been lost is not just a birthday, but a lifelong fantasy that has quietly sustained them. The fantasy was never extravagant. It was simple and human. The belief that one day, without being asked or earned, their parents would finally choose them, see them, and claim them emotionally in a way they never had before. Letting go of that belief feels like a small death. In the hours and days that follow, the narrator begins to replay memories with a new lens, and moments that once felt confusing now settle into a coherent, if painful, pattern. There is grief, but it is not loud or dramatic. It is private, contemplative, and deeply personal. The narrator grieves the parents they needed but never had, and the version of themselves that kept waiting, hoping, and adjusting in order to be worthy of attention. This grief is complicated by a sense of embarrassment, an awareness of how long they held onto the hope despite the evidence, but that shame slowly gives way to compassion. They begin to understand that the desire to be chosen was not weakness, it was a natural response to emotional deprivation. With that understanding comes a subtle but profound shift. The narrator stops asking what they did wrong and starts asking what they deserved. The question itself marks a turning point. Self-worth, once outsourced to parental validation, begins the slow process of being reclaimed. This does not happen all at once. There are moments of relapse, of reflexively seeking approval, of feeling the old ache resurface. But there is also a growing resolve to no longer participate in emotional transactions that require self-erasure. The narrator recognizes that continuing to hope for change from people who have shown no capacity or willingness to change is a form of self-abandonment. Accepting this truth is painful, but it is also clarifying. Boundaries begin to form, not as punishment, but as protection. The narrator limits what they share, adjusts expectations, and stops exposing their most vulnerable parts to indifference. This emotional distancing is not coldness, it is self-preservation. As parental approval loses its central role, space opens up for something new. The narrator begins to explore identity beyond the family narrative, discovering preferences, values, and strengths that were previously muted in the pursuit of acceptance. Independence takes shape not just practically, but emotionally. Decisions are made without waiting for permission or validation. Achievements are celebrated internally or with people who respond with genuine interest and care. Slowly, the narrator learns that being seen does not have to come from those who raised them. Along the way, a chosen family begins to emerge. Friends, mentors, partners, or even communities who offer consistency, warmth, and mutual respect. These relationships feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because they lack the conditionality the narrator is used to. Trust must be learned. Receiving care without having to earn it feels foreign, but also deeply healing. The narrator starts to notice the contrast, how ease replaces anxiety, how attention no longer feels scarce, how they are allowed to take up space without apology. This new relational experience reinforces the truth that the neglect they endured was not a reflection of their worth, but of their parents' limitations. Over time, the fantasy of being chosen loses its grip, replaced by a quieter, sturdier belief in self-selection. The narrator chooses themselves. They begin to invest energy where it is reciprocated, to define success and fulfillment on their own terms, and to let go of the need to prove anything to people who were never paying attention. There is still sadness, and there always will be, but it no longer dictates behavior. Instead of longing for recognition from the past, the narrator focuses on building a present that feels aligned and intentional. This shift brings a sense of peace that is not loud or triumphant, but deeply grounding. The narrator understands now that closure does not come from confrontation or apology, but from acceptance and redirection. The story does not end with reconciliation, but with self-respect. The parents remain who they are, unchanged, and the narrator no longer measures themselves against that immobility. The journey forward is not about erasing the past, but about integrating it without letting it define the future. In choosing boundaries, independence, and a chosen family, the narrator steps into adulthood not through recognition, but through resilience. What began as loss transforms into agency. The fantasy dissolves, and in its place stands something real, sustainable, and self-generated, a life built on worth that does not require permission.